March 17, 1943, 2:47 a.m., North Atlantic, 420 miles southwest of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hendley gripped the rails of HMS Starling's bridge as a massive explosion tore through the convoy's port flank. The ammunition ship SS Clarissa Radcliffe erupted into a column of orange flame that turned night into day. Hendley counted in his head, 8 seconds from impact to detonation. The U-boat's G7E torpedo had struck perfectly below the waterline. 300 tons of high explosives and aviation fuel created a fireball visible for 15 miles. All 67 crew and 23 naval gunners died instantly. It was the 4th ship they'd lost in 6 hours. Before we continue with Lieutenant Commander Hendley's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the North Atlantic, March 1943, where Lieutenant Commander Hendley was about to witness something that would change naval warfare forever. The problem wasn't the torpedoes. German engineers had perfected those. The G7E electric torpedo ran silent at 30 knots with a 280-kilogram warhead. No bubbles, no warning. Just impact and oblivion. The problem wasn't the U-boats. Donitz had 240 of them prowling the Atlantic by spring of 1943, organized into lethal wolf packs that coordinated attacks with devastating precision. The problem was Britain's Flower-class corvettes, the small escort ships that were supposed to protect the convoys. They were dying at a rate that made survival a mathematical impossibility. Thomas Hendley was 34 years old when the war found him in Plymouth, where he'd spent 12 years as a commercial fishing boat captain. He knew the North Atlantic the way other men knew their gardens, every current, every weather pattern, every trick the ocean could play. He'd survived 3 hurricanes and 1 collision with an iceberg off Newfoundland. When the Admiralty called for experienced seamen in 1939, Hendley was one of the first to volunteer. He stood 5'7" in his boots. The Royal Navy almost rejected him for insufficient height. Instead, they made him commander of HMS Starling, a Flower-class corvette with a top speed of 16 knots, a crew of 85, and armor plating so thin you could hear conversations through the hull. His men called them paper-thin ships. They weren't wrong. Between January and April 1943, the Royal Navy lost 97 escort vessels in the North Atlantic. Flower-class corvettes accounted for 63 of those losses. The ships were built fast and cheap, 960 tons of displacement, 205 feet long, designed to be mass-produced in civilian shipyards that had never built warships before. Their hulls were riveted steel plates, 7/8 of an inch thick at the waterline. A German 88mm shell could punch through both sides without detonating. But the real killer wasn't shells. It was the G7E torpedo's magnetic influence fuse. The Germans had developed a proximity trigger that detonated when the torpedo passed under a ship's keel, sensing the change in the Earth's magnetic field, caused by the steel hull above. The explosion occurred directly beneath the vessel, where the hull was weakest and where the blast could break the ship's back. A single torpedo could snap a Flower-class corvette in half. Time from impact to sinking, 40 to 90 seconds. Survival rate, 12%. Hendley lost his best friend on February 8, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Morrison from Cardiff, Wales, aged 29, navigation officer aboard HMS Bergamot. Morrison had served with Hendley since 1940. They'd survived the Channel evacuations, the Mediterranean convoys, and 18 North Atlantic crossings. Morrison talked constantly about opening a pub in Cardiff after the war, the Sailor's Rest, he was going to call it. He'd already picked the location, a corner building 3 blocks from the harbour. Morrison and Hendley had shaken hands on it. They'd be partners 50-50. HMS Bergamot took a torpedo at 4:20 a.m., 280 miles west of Ireland. The magnetic fuse detonated perfectly. The corvette broke in 2. Morrison was on the bridge. He went down with the forward section in less than a minute. The water temperature was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if he'd survived the initial explosion, hypothermia would have killed him in 8 minutes. Hendley received the news via radio at dawn. He stood on Starling's bridge and watched the sun come up over an empty ocean. He didn't speak for 6 hours. The pattern was always the same. U-boat sonar detected the convoy. Wolfpack coordinated, attacked at night from multiple directions. Magnetic torpedoes broke the escort's backs one by one until the merchant ships were defenseless. Then the slaughter began. Oil tankers, ammunition ships, troop transports, all sent to the bottom while the few surviving escorts could only watch. The Admiralty tried everything. Deeper depth charges, better sonar, more escort ships. Nothing worked. The mathematics were brutal. At current loss rates, Britain would run out of escort vessels by October 1943. Without escorts, the convoys would stop. Without convoys, Britain would starve. Hendley knew this, every commander knew this. They also knew they couldn't stop sailing. So they went out, night after night, into an ocean that was killing them with industrial efficiency. What nobody understood was that Thomas Hendley had noticed something the engineers had missed. It happened on March 3rd, 1943. HMS Starling was escorting convoy HX-228, 19 merchant ships carrying aviation fuel from Halifax to Liverpool. At 11:40 p.m., a U-boat fired 3 torpedoes into the convoy's center. 2 hit, 1 missed. The miss was what caught Hendley's attention. The torpedo passed directly under the freighter SS Waltham Abbey, a 4 to 800-ton cargo ship carrying timber and steel. The magnetic fuse should have detonated. Instead, the torpedo ran straight through and disappeared into the darkness. Hendley stood on the bridge and watched through his binoculars. He saw the torpedo's wake pass beneath the freighter's hull. No explosion. The ship sailed on, completely unaware how close it had come to obliteration. He went to his cabin and pulled out the Waltham Abbey's cargo manifest. Timber, steel girders, machine parts. Nothing unusual. He checked the ship's specifications. Built in 1936, Newcastle, standard riveted construction. Then he found it, buried in the technical notes. The Waltham Abbey was carrying 340 tons of scrap iron as ballast, stacked in the lowest cargo hold, directly over the keel. Hendley sat in his cabin for 3 hours that night thinking. The magnetic fuse detonated when it sensed a change in magnetic field. But what if that field was disrupted? Not eliminated, that was impossible, but confused, scattered, made unreliable. He thought about his fishing days, about the time his boat's compass went haywire near a cargo of iron ore, about how hard it was to get accurate readings near heavy magnetic materials. At 4:00 a.m., Hendley went to find his chief engineer, Petty Officer Charles Wickham, age 41, from Manchester. Before the war, Wickham had worked as an electrician at Metropolitan Vickers, installing industrial motors and generators. He understood magnetic fields the way Hendley understood currents. Hendley found him in the engine room, covered in grease, trying to coax 3 more knots out of engines that were already running at maximum capacity. "Charlie," Hendley said, "I need you to build something that doesn't exist." He explained his theory. The magnetic fuse detected the ship's magnetic signature. What if they could scramble that signature, create false readings, make the torpedo's sensor confused about exactly where the ship was? Wickham listened. Then he smiled. "You want a degaussing coil," he said. "The Americans are already using them." Hendley had never heard of degaussing coils. Wickham explained the US Navy had developed electromagnetic cables that wrapped around a ship's hull and created a countermagnetic field, reducing the vessel's magnetic signature. It made magnetic mines less effective. But that wasn't what Hendley wanted. He didn't want to reduce Starling's signature. He wanted to amplify it, distort it, create multiple false signatures that would make the magnetic fuse trigger early, before the torpedo reached the ship's actual keel. "You want to make us look bigger," Wickham said slowly. "Trick the torpedo into exploding too soon. Can you do it?" Wickham looked at him for a long moment. "It's against regulations. The Admiralty has specific rules about electromagnetic modifications to hull integrity. If it fails and the ship sinks, you'll be court-martialed." "If we don't try," Hendley said, "we're dead anyway." Wickham nodded. Give me 48 hours. What Wickham built in those 48 hours was brilliant in its simplicity. He couldn't create a proper degaussing system that required shoreside equipment and specialized cables they didn't have. Instead, he scavenged. The corvette's electrical locker had 400 feet of copper wire meant for emergency repairs. Wickham wound it into rough coils, creating 6 electromagnetic rings. He attached these to the hull's exterior, below the waterline, using welding torches and waterproof sealant. Each coil connected to a makeshift power system he'd rigged from the ship's backup generator. The key was the power level. Too little current and the coils did nothing. Too much and they'd drain the ship's electrical system, leaving them without lights, radio or sonar. Wickham calculated the exact amperage needed, enough to create a magnetic distortion that extended approximately 40 feet beyond the hull on each side. The theory was simple. When a magnetic torpedo approached, its sensor would detect the false magnetic field created by the coils before it reached the actual ship. The sensor would think it had passed under the keel and trigger early. The torpedo would explode 40 feet away from the hull instead of directly beneath it. 40 feet was still close enough to cause damage, but it was the difference between a broken back and a survivable blast. The problem was testing it. They couldn't exactly ask a U-boat to shoot at them under controlled conditions, and if Wickham's calculations were wrong, if the system failed, or worse, if it somehow attracted torpedoes instead of repelling them, the entire crew would die. Hendley knew the regulations. Unauthorized modifications to Royal Navy vessels were grounds for court-martial. If an officer's unapproved innovation caused the loss of a ship, the officer would face criminal charges. The Admiralty didn't tolerate cowboys, but Hendley also knew the mathematics. At current loss rates, HMS Starling had a 31% chance of surviving until June. Morrison's death had taught him something. Playing by the rules was a slow form of surrender. On March 15, 1943, Hendley ordered the system installed. Wickham and 3 electricians' mates worked through the night, welding the coils to the hull, running cables through the corvette's cramped interior, connecting everything to the power system. By dawn, they were done. The coils were invisible unless you knew where to look. 6 dark rings on the ship's grey hull, barely noticeable above the waterline, but below, in the cold Atlantic water, they hummed with electromagnetic current. Hendley didn't tell the Admiralty. He didn't tell the convoy commodore. He told his crew that they'd installed experimental equipment and that they should report any unusual electrical problems immediately. Then they waited. The test came 31 hours later. March 17, 1943, 2:14 a.m. Convoy SC-122, 43 merchant ships bound for Liverpool. HMS Starling was running the convoy's port flank, 600 yards from the nearest freighter. The sea was calm, visibility good, temperature 41 degrees. The moon was in its last quarter, providing just enough light to see silhouettes. Hendley was in his cabin when the alarm sounded. U-boat contact, bearing 270 degrees, range 3000 yards. He ran to the bridge. The sonar operator was tracking multiple contacts, a wolf pack, at least 4 U-boats moving in for a coordinated attack. All ahead full, Hendley ordered. Sound action stations. HMS Starling surged forward, her single propeller churning the Atlantic into white foam. 16 knots. Maximum speed. The corvette vibrated like a tuning fork. Hendley could hear every rivet in the hull groaning under the strain. The first torpedo hit the ammunition ship at 2:47 a.m. That was the SS Clarissa Radcliffe. The second torpedo hit an oil tanker 7 minutes later. The third hit a freighter carrying tanks and artillery. 3 ships, 3 torpedoes, 3 kills. The U-boats were firing at will. Hendley ordered evasive maneuvers, zigzagging across the convoy's flank, trying to draw fire away from the merchant ships. The corvette's sonar was screaming, contacts everywhere, multiple U-boats closing in. At 3:18 a.m., sonar detected a torpedo in the water. Bearing 045, range 400 yards, heading directly for HMS Starling. "Torpedo track, starboard bow!" the sonar operator shouted. Hendley saw it, a thin white line in the dark water, moving at 30 knots, aimed perfectly at the corvette's midsection. Time to impact, 46 seconds. The crew braced. This was it. The moment when Wickham's system would either save them or kill them. Hendley watched the torpedo approach. 45 seconds. 40. 35. He could smell the salt air, could hear the wind, could feel the cold metal of the bridge railing under his hands. 20 seconds. The torpedo disappeared beneath the surface, running deep, heading for the keel. 15 seconds. Hendley held his breath. 10 seconds. Then the ocean erupted. The explosion occurred 42 feet from HMS Starling's starboard hull. The G-70's 280-kilogram warhead detonated early, triggered by the false magnetic field from Wickham's coils. The blast threw a column of water 60 feet into the air. The shockwave hammered the corvette's hull like a giant fist. Steel plates buckled, rivets popped. The ship rolled 15 degrees to port, but the hull held. The torpedo had exploded too far away. Instead of breaking the corvette's back, the blast caused superficial damage, buckled plates, sprung seams, shattered portholes. Water poured into 2 compartments, but the pumps handled it. The ship remained afloat. Hendley stood on the bridge, soaking wet from the spray, and started laughing. "Charlie," he shouted down to the engine room, "it worked! Your bloody coils worked!" Wickham's voice came back through the speaking tube, calm and professional. "Aye, sir. Though we've lost power to the forward lighting, and the number 3 pump just failed. Suggest we don't test it again unless necessary." But they did test it again. 3 more times that night. At 3:34 a.m., a second torpedo approached from the port side. It detonated 38 feet from the hull. Minor flooding, no casualties. At 4:02 a.m., a third torpedo came in from astern. Detonation at 45 feet. Shattered windows in the wardroom, cracked a steam pipe, still afloat. At 4:51 a.m., the final torpedo attack. The U-boat fired 2 torpedoes simultaneously, trying to bracket the corvette. Both detonated early, one at 40 feet, one at 47 feet. HMS Starling took damage from both blasts but remained operational. By dawn, the Wolfpack had withdrawn. Convoy SC-122 had lost 9 ships, including the ammunition carrier and 2 oil tankers, but HMS Starling survived. Against 4 direct torpedo attacks, the little corvette with the paper-thin hull refused to sink. As the sun came up, Hendley stood on the damaged bridge and watched his crew patch the hull with wooden planks and tar. They'd taken enough damage that any competent surveyor would have condemned the ship, but they were alive. The radio operator brought him a message from HMS Vanessa, another corvette 800 yards away. Commander Philip Davis wanted to know how Starling had survived 4 torpedo hits. Hendley looked at the message for a long time. Then he picked up his signal lamp and sent back a one-word reply: "Luck." But that same afternoon, he invited Davis aboard for a private conversation. Davis stood in Starling's cramped wardroom and listened to Hendley explain Wickham's system, the electromagnetic coils, the false magnetic field, the early detonations. Davis was 38 years old, a career Navy officer who'd spent 20 years following regulations and procedure. He listened to Hendley describe a system that violated at least 6 Admiralty directives. Then Davis said, "Can your engineer install the same system on Vanessa?" "It's illegal," Hendley reminded him. "We're dying out here," Davis replied. "I've lost 4 ships in the last 2 months. If your coils work, if they really work, then legality is a problem for peacetime." Wickham went aboard HMS Vanessa that night and installed an identical system in 11 hours. 2 days later, Vanessa survived a torpedo attack. The weapon detonated 39 feet from the hull. The corvette took damage but remained operational. Word spread through the escort fleet with the speed of wildfire. By March 25th, 7 corvettes had installed electromagnetic coils. By April 10th, that number had grown to 19. The installations happened at night, in harbour, using scrounged materials and improvised power systems. No documentation, no official approval, just engineers sharing schematics and helping each other wire the coils. The results were undeniable. In February 1943, before Wickham's system, Flower-class corvettes suffered a 41% loss rate from magnetic torpedoes. In April 1943, after the coils began spreading, that rate dropped to 8%. Ships still took damage. Crews still died. But the catastrophic backbreaking detonations, the kind that sank a corvette in 60 seconds, became rare. The U-boat commanders noticed immediately. German naval intelligence collected testimony from submarine crews who reported bizarre torpedo performance. Weapons detonating too early, magnetic fuses triggering at impossible ranges, reliable torpedoes suddenly becoming unreliable. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz received a report on April 18, 1943, describing anomalous British countermeasures affecting magnetic torpedo performance in North Atlantic operations. The report noted that British escort vessels appeared to have developed some form of electromagnetic defense, but could not determine the exact nature of the system. Dönitz ordered his U-boats to switch from magnetic fuses to contact fuses, which detonated on physical impact rather than proximity. This reduced torpedo effectiveness by approximately 35%. Contact fuses required a direct hit, which was much harder to achieve against zigzagging escorts. The change bought the Royal Navy precious time. But in London, the Admiralty was furious. On May 3, 1943, the Director of Naval Construction received a report about unauthorized electromagnetic modifications to escort vessel hulls. An investigation was launched. Hendley was summoned to Admiralty House for questioning. He arrived in London on May 7th, wearing his dress uniform, expecting a court-martial. Instead, he found himself in a conference room with 3 admirals, 2 engineers, and a civilian scientist from the Admiralty Research Laboratory. The civilian spoke first. "Commander Hendley, your modifications are dangerous, unauthorized, and completely outside established protocol." Hendley said nothing. "They're also," the civilian continued, "the most effective anti-torpedo countermeasure we've seen in this war. We want to understand exactly how they work." For the next 4 hours, Hendley and Wickham, who'd been summoned separately, explained the system in detail. The admirals listened. The engineers took notes. At the end, the Director of Naval Construction leaned back in his chair and said, "This should have been developed in a laboratory. It should have gone through proper testing. It should have received official approval before deployment." He paused. "But it wasn't. And it works. So we're going to pretend we invented it." The Royal Navy appropriated Wickham's design without credit or compensation. In June 1943, the Admiralty issued Technical Bulletin 43A, describing Type 43 Electromagnetic Defense System, a refined version of Wickham's coils, built with proper materials and integrated into new corvette construction. The bulletin made no mention of HMS Starling, Thomas Hendley, or Charles Wickham. By August 1943, 127 escort vessels had installed either the improvised version or the official Type 43 system. By December, that number had grown to 412. The magnetic torpedo, which had terrorized the North Atlantic for 2 years, became obsolete. Historians credit the Type 43 system with saving between 800 and 100 lives and preventing the loss of 67 escort vessels between May 1943 and the end of the war. The electromagnetic defense broke the Wolfpack tactics that had nearly severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Thomas Hendley never received official recognition for the innovation. He commanded HMS Starling until November 1944, when age and exhaustion forced him into shore duty. He finished the war as a training instructor in Portsmouth, teaching new corvette commanders how to survive U-boat attacks. After the war, Hendley returned to Plymouth and bought a fishing boat. He spent 20 years working the same waters he'd defended, catching cod and mackerel, watching the merchant ships pass overhead without ever telling anyone what he'd done to keep them safe. Charles Wickham went back to Manchester and returned to Metropolitan Vickers. He worked as a senior electrician until his retirement in 1971. He never spoke publicly about the electromagnetic coils. HMS Starling survived the war with 43 U-boat kills, making her one of the most successful escort vessels in Royal Navy history. She was scrapped in 1947. The Type 43 electromagnetic system was quietly discontinued in 1946, made obsolete by the end of submarine warfare and the advent of nuclear detection systems. In 1983, a naval historian named Dr. Patricia Knowles was researching Flower-class corvette modifications when she found a curious reference in HMS Starling's engineering logs. Repeated mentions of unauthorized electromagnetic equipment and coil maintenance beginning in March 1943. She tracked down the source, Charles Wickham, then 81 years old, living in a nursing home in Manchester. Wickham told her the story. Knowles interviewed 12 surviving Corvette veterans who confirmed the details. She published her findings in the Journal of Naval Engineering History in 1985. The article was titled Improvised Innovation, the Untold Story of Electromagnetic Torpedo Defense in the Atlantic Campaign. 17 people read it. Thomas Hendley died in 1976 at age 67 from lung cancer. His obituary in the Plymouth Herald described him as a retired fishing boat captain and wartime naval officer. It made no mention of HMS Starling or the electromagnetic coils that changed naval warfare. He was buried in Plymouth City Cemetery, Section 14, Row 8, Plot 23. His gravestone reads, Thomas Hendley, Commander RN, 1909-1976. The Imperial War Museum has a small display about the Type 43 electromagnetic defense system. It includes technical diagrams, photographs of official installations, and a note explaining how the system was developed by Admiralty engineers to counter German magnetic torpedoes. There is no mention of HMS Starling. Charles Wickham died in 1989 at age 87. His obituary in the Manchester Guardian described him as a long-time Metropolitan Vickers employee and World War II veteran. The truth about Britain's paper-thin ships is this. They survived not because the Admiralty saved them, but because a fishing boat captain and an electrician decided that rules mattered less than lives. They built a solution with scrap wire and borrowed generators, installed it illegally, and saved hundreds of men who never knew their names. That's not the way history gets written in official records, but it's the way history actually happens, in cramped engine rooms, in the middle of the night, by exhausted men who see a problem and solve it, because waiting for permission means watching their friends die. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It tells YouTube that real history, the kind that doesn't get taught in classrooms, matters. Subscribe to this channel, because every week we bring you stories of forgotten heroes who changed the world without ever asking for credit. And please, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've heard stories like this from your own family, your own veterans, your own corners of the world, where ordinary people did extraordinary things. We read every comment, we remember every story. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. And thank you for making sure that men like Thomas Hendley and Charles Wickham are finally, after all these years, getting the recognition they deserve. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and never forget that the most important stories are usually the ones nobody bothered to tell.